It would be nice to hear the story of how they came to be as well, particularly because I know there's a lot of skepticism about personality, psychology, and the big five and whether it's a real thing or not, or just pseudoscience. I'd really love to hear the story behind it.
Yeah, there are a couple of stories. I alluded earlier to the big trait debate in psychology and whether there are stable traits. And I had mentioned that the big five arose in part. There was a long history to the development of the big five, but it arose in part as a very strong reaction against this dismissal of the utility of traits. So there's several lines we can discuss here. One line of argument is that if you want to predict consequential outcomes, um, like whether a person is going to run afoul of the law, or whether they're going to have rocky relationships, or whether they're going to die early, notwithstanding some physical health issues, above and beyond physical health are the things related to longevity and so on that may be related to these. And the quick answer is yes, traits are good predictors of those consequential outcomes. And there's a mountain of research that documents what those are. Precisely what the causal mechanisms are is another question. But the pragmatic question, do personality traits have utility? I think the answer now is yes, indeed they do. And of the many studies that were done, the vast number of them settled on a five-factor view, sometimes called the Big Five. There's a link between the two, but it's popularly called the Big Five perspective on personality. And these spell out an acronym, which is OCEAN, where openness stands, O stands for open to experience, C, conscientiousness, E, extroversion, A, agreeableness, and N, neuroticism. And these contrast with the opposite sides of open, and these are normally distributed. They're not all or none. Unlike some of the early personality tests, I think the Myers-Briggs and so on, which research psychologists are more skeptical of, these are normally distributed and they are robustly so. So you're not going to get individuals in a distribution going like this. It's going to be normally distributed. So most people on extroversion, for example, would be arbitrarily designated as ambiverted. They're somewhere in between. But these, so the opposite end of the normally distributed poles of openness to experience would be somebody who is open and engaged with the world, and somebody who is closed and rather wants to do things in a traditional way and don't overload me with too much information that is discordant with my traditional beliefs and so on. In conscientiousness, you have people who are highly conscientious by definition, and those who are more lackadaisical and informal and what the heck, satisficing creatures more than perfectionists. And so we could go down each of those, but I think it's really interesting to look at the prediction of some of the consequential outcomes as a function of each of these. So if we start with openness to experience, the open to experience individual has a low threshold for being excited by things around her. Their enthusiasm for seeing what's new and attending to it, noticing things that are in the environment that are distinctive and novel. The open to experience person is also characterized by one of its subfactors is kind of intellectuality and interest in ideas, interested in experiences. Is a broad panoply of experiences that open individuals experience. The scores on openness are a good predictor of success in creative professions. And the reason for this is pretty clear, that highly conscientious and highly open to experience individuals love to get involved in what is new. They also show a certain degree of restraint from getting in the same old conventional ways of doing things. And so after a while, they say, no, we do that all the time. Let's look at it this way. And this may range from the way in which you do your exercise regimen to the creation of wonderful works of art. The characteristics of highly creative people, as a slight segue from that, are really quite intriguing, because they are, on the one hand, driven by a positive emotional core that is unstoppable. At the same time, they can be very moody and very difficult to work with. A highly creative person, a person who is highly open to experience and is engaged in the creative process, can be oblivious to the niceties of life, certainly of social niceties, and they can be very, very hard to tolerate. And so in one of the chapters in my book, I have a whole section on the myth of the creative genius, the lone creative genius, that I don't believe that highly creative individuals create on their own, but are aided and abetted by those who also sit and wait and tell them that their fly's open, or tell them that they should be more outgoing or be more receptive to the people who are coming to see them. They actually pay the checks that are supposed to be paid to the vendors. Without those other individuals who create the background to the creative process, the highly creative product or the highly creative project would not get completed. And I think there's a kind of this myth of the individual hero that sometimes gets us into difficulties, because too often there's a kind of blasé attitude that they do it on their own. Not necessarily, in fact, highly unlikely. So if we go down the rest of the links between the traits, the big five, and consequential outcomes, we get to conscientiousness. And this is, in a way, a contrast to open to experience. Highly conscientious individuals are particularly interested in getting things right, doing the right thing. They get things done on time, and they show alacrity in doing what needs to be done to finish the day with tasks completed, deeds done. And highly creative individuals, those who are very conscientious, generally have a number of very positive consequential outcomes. Some are pretty obvious. It's pretty obvious that a highly conscientious person is going to do better in school. They do. They're going to do better in promotions through various organizations and companies. They do. One would expect that they would generally, in all parts of life requiring tasks to be done, they should succeed, and they do. What may be less obvious is that these are among those who are most likely to live longer lives. And that health consequence of conscientiousness is perhaps not quite as obvious. And it seems to me that the reason that highly conscientious people live longer lives is that they are characterized by sticking to regimens, such as a health regimen, that will serve their health. Right? The highly conscientious person takes his pills on a regular basis. The highly conscientious person will stick to her training regimen even though it's winter and it's tough, but she's still doing that. and grandma is still out lifting weights. And so you have these seemingly highly productive individuals at the same time being very helpful with respect to their own health. And that's I think that is a rather less expected aspect of conscientiousness. Extroversion is generally associated with well-being and positive affect or positive emotions, happiness. I can get into some sub-components of these traits. For example, extroversion is differentiable into enthusiasm, but also assertiveness. And enthusiasm is something that is associated with positive outcomes. Assertiveness, not necessarily, although it may aid and abet getting tasks done, but it may alienate to a certain extent people in your environment, unless it's handled judiciously and with tact. And there are many differences between the extroverted and introverted person. Many of them were captured by Susan Cain's book, Quiet, which
I've heard of that.
Yeah, it was probably, it may well still be on the bestseller list. She has a new book since then, but Quiet was a plea to understand that introverted individuals have important characteristics, that they have quiet strengths, we might say, that are very important to take into account, and that there has been a particularly American valuing of extroversion, the extrovert ideal, which has had, in her judgment, and given the sales of her books, multitudes have agreed with her on this. It has led to a diminishment of the and a lack of appreciation of introverted individuals. And so there has, and I've long lectured on this as an introvert myself. Yeah, from 1970 on, I've been giving talks on extroversion and sort of letting it, and that I was very introverted. And people would come up after, as they certainly do with Susan, and say, "You've really changed my life. I didn't realize what was happening in my marriage, for example, until I found out a little bit about this extroversion-introversion dimension." So we can talk more about that later, because it gets to the whole notion of free traits and acting on a character and so on. But we'll get into that later. But extroversion, excuse me, does have a number of consequential outcomes associated with it. If you combine it with neuroticism, the fifth of the big five, and the low scores on neuroticism and high scores on extroversion are very good predictors of satisfaction with life, of happiness. And so if you want to ask a person what their extroversion and the opposite of neuroticism is stability scores are, gives you a pretty good idea of how happy they're going to be. Does this mean that there's no route to happiness, meaning in life, for those who are not extroverted, or for those who are somewhat neurotic or anxious? And I think the clear answer is no. But what we need to do as psychologists is to find out what are those paths through which individuals can glean delight, find happiness, and extract meaning in ways that don't restrictively conform to social expectations. And that's something that I and my students have been riveted by in our attempts to look at human nature. Those who do take the lesser trodden path, and what happens to them, and how might we open up more paths for them, which gets us from the study of traits into the study of projects and action, away from the adjectives of life to the verbs of life. And that's where we're hitting. A couple more of the big five traits of life. Agreeableness. Agreeableness is fascinating because high scores are predictable of working well in groups. Most people like to have agreeable people around them because they're not a pain in the neck. They're pretty positive. Maybe some can be annoyingly so, but they're pretty positive individuals. But the risk factor of agreeableness is that you may end up being taken advantage of. And highly agreeable people don't like to be disagreeable. Therefore, they benefit in groups, large and small, by those who are low in agreeableness, who are able to confront evil, to confront injustice. The agreeable person is unlikely to say, hey, don't do that to her because it's not my business. I'm just a nice, quiet guy. And what's going on over there really bothers me, but, But the disagreeable person says, what? What are you doing? And confronts. And yes, he's being disagreeable. She's being disagreeable. But that, in the case of interventions, in cases of impropriety or illegality, or just plain evil, those individuals have consequential outcomes that are positive. And so I guess as I go through these, it raises the criterion issue. By what do we mean by a positive outcome of having certain traits? And if we were just to say that it's nice to be happy and healthy and wise, it may miss out a whole bunch of other virtues in human living that may be better predicted by combinations of traits that are not normally regarded as in themselves positive. Now, it's true that highly disagreeable people are much more at risk for cardiovascular disease, for example. And so being low on agreeableness does have that consequential outcome. And that the reason is, it used to be thought that type A personality was a time-driven person who was busy. And there was some superficial truth to that. But the real causal path, the behavioral pathogen, is hostility. And so I've often come across in talking to senior executives cases where a very active, extroverted, busy, project-oriented individual is told to slow down, dear, slow down. We're on our holidays. I think you have your cell phone out. Don't look at it. Relax. Take in the sun. Breathe deeply. You're probably, if he is a energetic extrovert person, you're probably increasing his hostility by insisting that he slow down. And so you have this inadvertent inversion of your influence, where instead of making him healthier, you're actually making him more frustrated and increasing hostility, which is the behavioral pathogen. So again, things get complex, even when you start dealing with traits. But the basic, and if we get finally on the big five to neuroticism, it is basically, these are feelings of anxiety and feelings of depression or depressive affect. Neuroticism as a personality trait is not neurosis, as a psychoanalyst or someone else would call it. That is a putative disease entry, a disease entity. Rather, it is, again, a normally distributed trait disposition to experience negative affect. Extroversion is largely a disposition to experience positive affect. And so you have very different consequences of those two traits in terms of affective experience. So those are the big five, and some of the consequentialities. You can predict criminal behavior in large part from the inability to have sufficient agreeableness that you don't care about hurting other individuals. You can have ego control problems and so on. But that was the answer to the attack upon traits. The pragmatic answer is look what we're able to do. Now, when I'm lecturing on this, I often say, there you go. There are your traits. How you doing? I think I know you're happy because I see your scores. You got a bit of a problem there. If I wouldn't do this. But if I were to walk around and say, look at this all here. His agreeableness score is way, way, way too low. But aren't we missing something when we deal with traits in that way? When we deal with personality as merely the instantiation of supposedly enduring traits that are fairly consistent. And that's been empirically studied too. And the trait psychologists can make a very strong point that the rank order on these traits is pretty constant over the lifetime. Now, there are changes that occur with age. We get less extroverted, for example, at certain stages of life. We grow less neurotic, more agreeable, and so on. But within those normative changes, there are the individuals, the rank order of them stays fairly stable. I mean, way more stable than those who criticize traits would believe. That you may be a lot less extroverted now at mid-age than you were in grade 12. But if you go back to your high school reunion, you'll still be, relative to the kid next to you who is rather introverted, you'll still be the one who's cracking jokes and having a good time and so on. Even though in absolute terms, your extroversion score is lower than it was when you were in high school. So those are the big five traits. And as I say, I believe strongly that there are fates beyond traits. And that's where my work on personal projects comes in.